Bene, allora stasera abbiamo proprio la professoressa Noga Banai con noi, che tiene la sua presentazione su Ebraismo, così l'arte dell'Ebraismo. Lei è una collega, ma è anche veramente una cara amica. Ci siamo incontrati quando io ho insegnato alla Hebrew University, come lei insegna alla Hebrew University in Gerusalemme. Sarà con noi la settimana prossima nel laboratorio con gli studenti. Eccola. Così la professoressa è proprio il capo del programma d'eccellenza di dottorato dell'università e è interessata all'arte proprio del pellegrinaggio, così anche i collegamenti tra arte ebraica e cristiana, tra Gerusalemme e Roma. Così lei ha fatto diversi progetti, ma soprattutto anche diverse pubblicazioni. Così, per esempio, il suo libro sull'influenza di Gerusalemme sull'arte cristiana ed ebraica a Roma e soprattutto anche sulle catacombe ebraiche. Proprio la settimana prossima parliamo proprio su un'opera che sta proprio nelle catacombe sotto la Villa Tolonia. Abbiamo cercato tutto di forse entrare, ma è veramente impossibile. Ma lei lavora da tanto tempo su questo tema, ma lei ha scritto anche, per esempio, un altro libro, The Trophies of the Martyrs, an Art Historical Study of Early Christian Silver Reliquaries and Sacred Stimulus, Jerusalem in the Visual Christianization of Rome. C'è proprio sempre questo legame tra Roma, Gerusalemme, l'arte ebraica e l'arte cristiana. Io non voglio perdere tempo, lasciamo subito la parola a lei. Lei parlerà in inglese, per questo abbiamo preparato la traduzione. Eccola, se qualcuno ha bisogno. E per favore, tocca. Now it's your turn. I'm really happy that you're here with us tonight and also next week, because it's really an honor to have you with us, because not only because you are specialized in this field, but because you are a lovely person. And so it's your turn.
Don't exaggerate. Thank you very much. Good evening. I'm really thankful for the invitation, and I want to thank Professor Ambrogio Bongiovanni, the director of the Center for Interreligious Studies. And of course, I want to thank my dear, good friend and colleague, Professor Yvonne Donna Schlobitan. I will share the screen, just a second. Okay. I will talk about Jewish art tonight, but I thought that it will be good. I mean, you cannot talk about Jewish art or everything about Jewish art in an hour and a half, or 45 minutes. So I chose a specific topic which will allow me to introduce the main challenges, I think, in Jewish art, especially in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, but I will end with one modern example. Okay? So until recently, almost all general discussion on Jewish art began with the cycle of frescoes decorating the walls of Dura Europos synagogue. The building was destroyed in 256 by the Persians, and this sets a terminus ante quem for all the wall paintings. Let me just say that all the dates that I will mention tonight are in the Common Era, nothing before, okay? So I don't need to say each time Annus Domini, Common Era, etc. It's always after, okay. So this synagogue in Dura Europos was destroyed in the 3rd century. The synagogue murals are more elaborated than those of the nearby baptistry and richer in borrowings from pagan imagery. And this is inside the synagogue. But the earliest murals decorating the Torah shrine. Yvonne, just tell me if you see the mouse.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
I can
wonderful.
see it. I can see it.
Okay, okay. So, but the earliest murals decorating the Torah shrine, which is right here, display symbols, while the one on the flanking walls, painted some years later, display complete figurative biblical scenes. They reveal ties to diverse Jewish words, thereby attesting to a widespread Jewish artistic culture in late antiquity. This is the earliest, the first example, but it relates to later examples that we see in other places. Okay? So when I was a student, this is a prehistorical period, yeah? When I was a student, when we learned about Jewish art, this was the first example, and they always told us that Jewish art as a phenomena, as something that can be analyzed, existed only after the destruction of the Second Temple, that is the year 70, which I'm sure you all know. So there was no Jewish art before. However, the recent discovered building at Magdala in the Galilee indicates that the custom of decorating a synagogue with colorful paintings and aniconic mosaics began as early as the 1st century. The design of the Magdala synagogue hall is centralized with a shallow stone table that could schematically represent the temple in Jerusalem. You see on the left where the stone table was found, at the center of the synagogue, and on the right you see the different. I apologize for the light in my room, it's automatic, so I have to do some choreography every few minutes. Okay, sorry. So this is the stone, the table stone at the middle, and on the side you see the stone from the various sides. And according to Rina Talgam, who did research on this stone, the reliefs on the different sides actually represent very schematically the temple in Jerusalem. So on the front you see here the menorah and 2 jars. Supposedly one is the jar of water and the other is the jar of oil that was used in the temple. Around you see these arches, this arcade. Supposedly the Azara, which was the area outside the Holy of Holies, that other people could see what's going on from the outside. On this side there are 2 wheels with some flames, which scholars think might represent the bottom part of the seat of God in heaven, as it's mentioned in the book of Yechezkel and of course later on in the Apocalypse. And on top you see this flower with 2 palmates at the side, which we know from the book, from the writings of Flavius Josephus. There were 2 palmates next to the Holy of Holies, and the flower here could have been or might represent the curtain of the shrine. Okay, so this is a schematical representation of the temple in Jerusalem. You can add question mark if you want, but this is what the scholars now say. The ornamented stone, which is more important right now, uncovered at Magdala, has expanded the scope of the discussion regarding Jewish art in the Second Temple period. Thus, the unsettled question, which, as I told you, I remember since I was a student, whether or not Jewish art as phenomena can be studied and analyzed or existed during the Second Temple period or only after its destruction, received new arguments in support of the first possibility, that there was Jewish art during the Second Temple period. The discovery of the Magdala stone offers an opportunity to examine, for the first time, the liturgical furniture used in the Torah reading ceremony in the synagogue of late Second Temple period. Over time, additional stone tables have been identified in several synagogues in the Galilee and the Golan, some of which have been only partly preserved. Scholars in recent years are seeking to define the function of these tables in synagogues that were used continuously from the late Second Temple period and in the first centuries of the Common Era. So I think a couple of months ago, this book by Rina Talgam, after a decade of research, has been published. Rina Talgam suggested that the stone served as a stool on which the portable teva, the portable chest containing a scroll, was laid during the reading of the Torah. The rest of the scrolls were stored in a special storeroom. This arrangement probably continued until the mid-4th century, when large Torah shrines were placed in the hall. Of course, there were some intermediate stages, for instance, the emergence of public prayer as a significant element in synagogue liturgy at the end of the 2nd century, which resulted in marking the direction toward Jerusalem with a small edicule that was designed to hold one scroll. Ze'ev Weiss, however, suggested that the stone was used as a low stand, at times covered with a piece of cloth, upon which the scroll was placed before the ceremony, during the breaks between the readers, and after its completion. He rejected the idea of the chest that was laid on the table stone. He thinks that with the transition from a single book scroll to a Torah scroll that contained the entire Pentateuch, the low table was replaced with an elevated pedestal or ambo made of wood or stone, which has since become the Torah lectern in the synagogues of ancient Palestine and the diaspora. Whether Rina Talgam is right or Ze'ev Weiss, at all events, what we see in the stone and in the early stage painting in Dura Europus, which I will show you in a minute, is the use of symbolic motifs rather than figurative art, in accordance with the 2nd commandment, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. Exodus 24. When we talk about ancient and even medieval Jewish art, then, the critical question is this challenge of no graven images versus the local cultural context, versus what's going on in the surroundings. Studying late antique and medieval Christian art most of my career, it is something I'm not used to, okay? This no graven images, of course, in Christian art, it's totally different. So I thought that today I will do good if I talk about this challenge by focusing on the earliest narrative scene survived in Jewish art, the sacrifice of Isaac. Seeing where it was represented inside the Jewish praying hall and understand its role within the decorative programs will bring to the fore 3 important issues related to Jewish art that I want to talk about. First, the no graven images, as I mentioned already. Second, the Jewish affinity to Jerusalem. And third, the attitudes towards, the reaction to, and the impact of the contemporary Christian art. Next week, in our open discussion, or laboratory, as Professor Donna calls it, I will continue to view Jewish art versus contemporary Christian art in Roma, by concentrating on Jewish symbolism and by asking if there is such thing as local Jewish layout and compositions. Today, I will talk about examples here in Palestine. And of course, I begin with Dura Europus. The earliest representation of the sacrifice of Isaac is indeed in Dura Europus. It appears in the earlier layer of frescoes confined to the wall around the Torah shrine. Right here, you see where the arrow is. I'm talking about this panel. And I apologize for the different colors. None of it, not this one, no, this one are the true colors. I couldn't find good illustrations. I apologize for that. But we will live with it. So please imagine that the background is blue. Okay? So against a light blue field that must refer to sky, the only sky in Dura, in all the wall paintings in Dura, and hence to the celestial venue of the iconography, the temple panel presents the 7-branch menorah, here, a lulav and etrog, right here. These are 2 of the 4 species of the symbols of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, and the temple in Jerusalem, which you see here. And at the right here, the sacrifice of Isaac. Here you have the detail enlarged. All the figures in the scenes, you see here one inside the tent. This is Sarah, the mother of Yitzchak. This is Yitzchak, or Isaac, on the altar, and this is Abraham. Okay, so all of them are drawn with their backs to the audience, to the viewer. It is generally accepted that this was a solution chosen to honor the second commandment. The layout associates the temple with the narrative of the sacrifice, reflecting the belief that the temple was built where the sacrifice took place, namely Mount Moriah. The essential symbolic meaning of the imagery has been accepted by most scholars as a reference to the lost temple in Jerusalem and as a promise for its restoration, redemption, and return. So it is actually an eschatological promise. I don't need to remind you that the Christians Christianity reject the idea that the temple of Jerusalem would be restored on earth. Of course, they believe instead in heavenly Jerusalem. Okay, but the Jews are praying for the restoration, the redemption, and return to earthly Jerusalem. It has been suggested that the symbols of the Feast of Tabernacle, the temple, and Mount Moriah foretell the future Feast of Tabernacle to be celebrated by all nations in Jerusalem as described in Zechariah 14, and I will read only the first line. And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacle. The decoration of the Torah shrine enables us to question the use of symbols in the focal area of the cult room. First, the avoidance of iconic imagery at the spot where it was most expected, in and around an edicule, made a significant statement about the nature of God of the Jews and about his relationship to his people. Unlike the pagan deities, the painting proclaims this God is not contained in matter, but is a spirit revealed historically through the covenant with Abraham and in daily life through the cult of the Torah. Second, every element of the design is found outside the city and at other times, later times, as I said at the beginning, leaving little doubt that the Jews of Dura incorporated in their building an established program of synagogue decoration. This is how we know that along the lulav and etrog, two of the four species, for the liturgical celebration of Tabernaculum, the shofar, the ram's horn, is usually rendered. In Dura, it is absent and it is replaced by the narrative depiction of the sacrifice of Isaac. Perhaps it is a reference to the sacrificial rituals presented in the pagan temples in Dura, which were not far away from the synagogue, such as in the temple of Bel. Abraham's abrogated call to the sacrifice and its instruments of the tabernacle to the left would have made the point that just as Jewish belief does not reside with idols, it is made manifest in faith, not in blood sacrifices. I think this is a good point to remind you, or maybe if you to explain, that in Hebrew we don't call the sacrifice of Isaac the sacrifice. We call it the akedah, the binding of Isaac, because he was not sacrificed at the end, he was saved. So it is the binding, but this is not the only reason. We don't call it the sacrifice of Isaac to differentiate it from the sacrifice of Christ. Okay? So when I say akedah, when I say binding of Isaac, I mean the sacrifice of Isaac. But in Hebrew, it's only the binding. Okay. More important, however, is that the replacement of the shofar, of the horn, with a full narrative of the akedah, of the binding, reflects a need to assert the historicity of God's covenant with Abraham, to recall the promise that because of Abraham's obedience, God would bless his descendants, was well suited to a synagogue of an exiled community as the community in Dura. The promise said, all nations on earth shall pray to be blessed as your descendants are blessed, and this because you have obeyed me. From Genesis 22. Perhaps what we see in Dura is actually the beginning of visual response to Christian claims and therefore a narrative scene for the first time in Jewish art. After all, beginning with Paul, whether in the Epistle to the Romans 9 or to the Galatians 4, which you have here, Christians claim that God's special relationship with the Jews established through Abraham had been abrogated and had passed to them. I will only read the first line, now from Galatians. Now you, brothers and sisters, like Isaac, are children of promise. The painter in Dura asserted a historical claim built entirely from Jewish components. The symbolic program refers first of all to the historical agreement God made with Abraham, and second, to the implied promise of future redemption when the temple in Jerusalem would be restored and the great feast of tabernacle revived. Both Flavius Josephus, and the rabbis linked the site of the sacrifice with that of the temple. And please remember that the site of the sacrifice and the site of the temple are one, and it has an important implication for understanding the rest of the synagogue frescoes, the figurative one, which I will not discuss today, as well as the insertion of the binding of Isaac in Palestinian synagogues under Christian rule, to which I will turn now. The excavation of several Galilean-type synagogues over the years demonstrate that several communities decided to decorate their prayer halls with colorful mosaics containing figurative images. The finds show that figurative mosaics seem to have first appeared in the 4th century. The various mosaics provide insight regarding the layout of mosaic carpets featuring geometric and floral design, figurative images, Jewish symbols, and mainly the portrayal of biblical scenes and the zodiac. You see some examples in front of you from the 4th, 5th, and 6th century. The number of known biblical scenes in synagogues art is not particularly large, and the scenes usually vary from one site to the next. The growing number and distribution of biblical scenes throughout the region may allude to an even wider practice among the Jews of antiquity to decorate their prayer hall with such scenes. And of course, you might want to ask me, how come they did that? And we still and read the second commandment or obey the second commandment? Isn't it against the second commandment of no graven images? In a passage of the Jerusalem Talmud, it is stated, in the days of Rabbi Yochanan, who lived in the 3rd century, they began to paint on walls, and he did not object. In the days of Rabbi Abun, who lived in the 4th century and was Rabbi Yochanan's disciple, they began to make designs on mosaics, and he did not object. In contrast to common interpretations, Rina Talgam suggested years ago that the development was not an extension of the synagogue decorations from wall paintings to the inclusion of floor mosaics, but was marked by the preference for the floor mosaics over the wall paintings. And why? Why would they start doing that in the 4th century? Then Christian. In contrast to the Christian realm, such things were considered appropriate to display on synagogue floors. The imperial edict of 427 forbid the depictions of crosses on floors, and we know that human figures appeared mainly on walls. In the synagogues, the floor mosaics became the routine medium for decoration, because treading on them, stepping on them, ensured that they would not become a project of worship, an object of worship. Artists depicted the hand of God, the sacred utensils, and biblical heroes in places that were meant to be stepped on, in order to make it clear that the visual representations are but a faint shadow of the original. The transfer of narrative panels from the wall, as seen in Dura, to the floor created a change in the way people who gathered in the synagogues viewed the entire composition. The seating arrangement around the walls, like in a Roman villa, enabled a more or less complete view of the mosaics. Let us see, for example, the floor mosaic of the synagogue in Sepphoris. As the historical capital of the Galilee, the city spread in the 2nd century, boasting an impressive grid of streets, various public buildings, a temple, forum, theater, library or archive, bathhouses, churches, synagogues. No synagogue from the Roman period is presently known, although extant excavations, but its existence can be cautiously deduced from the rabbinic sources. 3 synagogues, all dated to the 5th century, are currently known in Sepphoris. One of them, in front of you, you see here in the slide, was completely unearthed in 1993-1994. Its architectural layout and location of the bima on the western side of the synagogue indicates that the direction of prayer and the orientation of the building were not towards Jerusalem. We have some cases of synagogues that are oriented toward Jerusalem and some cases that are not in that period. It was not obligatory. There is no apse and only main hall and a single aisle. The mosaic was designed as one long carpet. And in the aisle, one can find some inscription, dedicatory inscription in Aramaic. The carpet is divided into 7 horizontal bands. The zodiac dominates the center, you see it here. The depictions below the zodiac associated with the patriarchs, and the panel above it portray primarily motifs relating to the tabernacle and the destroyed Jerusalem temple. The first band, which you see here in 2 details, excuse me, the light has, okay. So the first band, adjacent to the bima, contains an inscription in Greek, which is we only have a fragment of it. It starts with a blessing upon him, and this inscription is flanked by 2 lions. One of them you can see here in front of you. The second band features an architectural facade flanked by 7 branched menorah, and the 4th species and a ram's horn. You can see one fragment here. There was the same thing on the other side. So here is the menorah, pomegranate, lulav, shofar, and the rest of the species. The 3rd and 4th band serves as a narrative depiction of Exodus 29, which tells the story of the consecration of Aaron and his sons in the service of the tabernacle. This is what you are to do to consecrate them, so they may serve me as priests. Take a young bull and 2 rams without defect, and from the finest wheat flour make round loaves without yeast, thick loaves without yeast and with olive oil mixed in, and thin loaves without yeast and brushed with olive oil. Sounds like they were making pasta, but that's not the case. Put them in a basket and present them along with the bull and the 2 rams. So this Exodus 29 is represented in these 2 bands that you see here. The zodiac and the 4 seasons come next in the 5th and central band. Notice please the aniconic Helios or Sol Invictus here in the middle. You can see here the horses, and here in the middle is the sun. The 6th and 7th band contain the story of Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac. The left panel depicts the 2 youths whom Abraham left together with an ass at the foot of the mountain. The right panel, right here, is badly damaged, but it is possible to discern a tree with a few branches and a head of a ram, right here. Here is the head, tied to the tree. In addition, 2 pairs of shoes here, removed by Abraham and Isaac when reaching the site of the sacrifice, are visible below the tree. In the center of the scene, here, a blade of a raised knife and the remains of a clock are identifiable. The 7th and last band of the mosaic adjacent to the entrance to the prayer hall, and those seen first by anyone entering the synagogue, show the visit of the three men to Abraham, the philoxenia. So if I stand here at the entrance to the synagogue, I see a door. You see here? On the left there is a door, and inside the door, so you at the door and you look at a door. You're standing inside the door and you look at the door. This is really nice. And then inside this door panel, you see a figure, and in comparison to San Vitale in Ravenna, which you see here on the right, it is commonly thought that here stood Sarah, the mother of Isaac, and here was the scene when Abraham gives food or welcomes the three angels, the philoxenia. The philoxenia, this in Mamre, is the biblical narrative that precedes the story of the binding of Isaac. The combination of the two scenes, the philoxenia and the binding, makes its first appearance in Jewish art here in Sepphoris, therefore completing an iconographic unit with one clear message: God's promise to Abraham that not only will his son succeed him, but all of Abraham's countless progeny, will be blessed, protected, and shielded from danger. So the overall program in 5th century Sepphoris represents the core issues of the contemporaneous Judeo-Christian controversy. The Jews are the chosen people, the future redemption according to Jewish conception, the rebuilding of the temple had not yet come to fruition. It is the earthly temple, though, presently in ruins, that will be rebuilt someday in the holy city of Jerusalem. The zodiac, which is a pagan motif, was incorporated into the floor of 8 synagogues known to date, which is a particularly large number compared to other motifs in synagogue art. And it symbolizes God's power and deeds as the sole ruler of the universe. This God remembered his promise to Abraham. The agriculture features in remember this promise to Abraham. The agriculture features in the zodiac and their cyclic appearance emphasize the divine promise will be fulfilled one day on earth. So if we look at these mosaics, whether in Sepphoris here or in Hamat Veria, we don't have the sacrifice of Isaac, but in Sepphoris in the 5th century, and here in Bet Alpha in the 6th century, above the zodiac, you see the panel of Jerusalem temple, the temple in Jerusalem. Below the zodiac, you see the scene of the sacrifice of Isaac, which took place on Mount Moriah, the same place of the temple. And in between, you see the zodiac, that promise the cycle of time, that promise the return to Jerusalem, to earthly Jerusalem. This is the core idea of the mosaic here and in Sepphoris and in other places. The same idea, we know this idea not only from art, we find it also in Jewish prayers, in rabbinic ceremonies, and in liturgical poetry, in Piyutim. And here it is transmitted throughout within the praying hall, and it gives a clear message to the local community of the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple and the coming redemption. Is this what we are going to find in medieval synagogues? None are left in Palestine. Therefore, we will look into representation of the binding of Isaac elsewhere. I will bring 2 examples from medieval manuscripts, and you will see how they too relate to the praying hall in the synagogue and to the Judeo-Christian clash. So I'm moving on now to the Middle Ages. Medieval synagogues were always modest in size and appearance. A limited repertoire of carved vegetal or zoomorphic motifs does appear in some Jewish prayer halls, but the figural decoration typical of the Christian places of worship was absent. Narratives and figures were limited to the illumination of large prayer books used by the cantor and smaller copies for private use within the communal ceremonies ordered by those members of the community who could afford them. These images were usually located in or next to initial word panels or within the text column. Other images were dispersed along the margins and referring often to the main text. This intimate and tangible relationship between word and image on the page form a special case of integration between the visual and the textual. Operation of word and image facilitates the practice of belief, stabilizes elusive notions, and gives clear expressions to hinted implications. In the Hebrew illuminated manuscript, especially in the Hebrew Ashkenazi illuminated manuscript, which I will show today, this cooperation enabled worshippers to interact, but not with saints, rather with the human ancestors of the Jewish people and related fundamental biblical events perceived in the liturgy as ancestral merits, as models. While the basic text used in such collaborations was recited or sung by the cantor or believers and formed a consistent obligatory part of the liturgy, the images were always a flexible, non-obligatory addition, open to variations, as you see here in front of you. The Noah's Ark, the Seder meal in Passover, or the calendar table. I will exemplify the phenomenon through the lens of the biblical narrative of Isaac's sacrifice in two Ashkenazi liturgical manuscripts of around 1300, from two different locations in the Holy Roman Empire, Brussels and Esslingen. Each case will represent a different result, as well as a different way of interaction with the Christian urban society. I want to add that this part of my lecture is based on research done by my good friend and colleague, who is an expert on medieval Hebrew manuscript, Professor Sarit Shalev-Eni, that teaches with me here at the University in Jerusalem. You will have the reference later. The first example is from Brussels. Jews settled in Brussels in the Duchy of Brabant not later than 1260. Around 1300, the Duchy of Brabant absorbed some Jewish immigrants who had been expelled from England and France in 1290 and 1306. These immigrants may have included the family of Isaac the scribe, the son of Elijah, the cantor of the Jewish community in Oxenford, which is Oxford, who in 1309 in Brussels completed a liturgical Pentateuch for personal use. The liturgical Pentateuch includes the weekly biblical portions read in the synagogue. Each verse of the text is written in both Hebrew and Aramaic, reflecting the ancient custom that required each member of the community to read each verse of the portion twice, once in Hebrew and once in Aramaic, in parallel with the public reading. The main text is accompanied by the commentary of Rashi, Rabbi Solomon ben Yitzchak, the well-known French commentator, which was regarded by some 13th century authorities as a substitute for the Aramaic translation. One of the three scribes, who was also the illuminator, left a colophon. I will read it, or just part of it. You have it in front of you. I, a Kudamor, will thank the Lord of the universe. I completed the painting and writing. This scribe illuminator, whose name was probably Isaac, used the phrase Akud Hamor, meaning the bound of the Mor. Mor is a poetic abbreviation of Mount Moriah, the site of Isaac's binding on the altar by his father, according to the Lord's commandment. Some of the illustrations of the so-called bound of Mor, the nickname of this painter, whose given name was Isaac, appears as marginal annotations to the text. One of them depicts the binding of Isaac. Here, the naked Isaac is lying on the back above a pile of burning coals, which are arranged to form an altar-like shape. Isaac's legs and hands are bound together, while Abraham pulls his son's hair and brandishes his sword in preparation for the sacrifice. Abraham is turning back to an angel who appears from above, stopping him from doing so by holding the blade with one hand and pointing with the other to the ram, whose horns cling to the small tree here. The Jewish illuminator, who was acquainted with the local Christian iconography, as the inclusion in this context of the angel's halo and the sword instead of the traditional Jewish knife shows. But he also included a unique component. Abraham wears a talit, this here, a prayer shawl, a rectangular piece of cloth with fringes attached to its four corners. At that time, the talit was regarded as ritual attire, and wrapping oneself in the talit was a ritual act related to prayer. In Jewish corpora of biblical interpretations known as midrashim and Ashkenazi illuminations, the talit became the attribute of the cantor in the synagogue. How can we understand the inclusion of this liturgical item in the biblical scene? What was its impact on the viewer and on the mechanism of the Jewish word-image collaboration? In order to tackle this question, one should start with the immediate context, the integration of the image and text on the page. The page for us now is the space. The marginal scenes illustrate the biblical text of Isaac's binding written in the main column. Here, these are the two main columns. A special reference is made to the last verse of the narrative, here, and Abraham named that place where the event took place, the Lord will see. That was the name that Abraham gave to the place. Genesis 22:14. In the written text of the commentary, interwoven within the image, here, this is Rashi, okay, the first word, all this is Rashi. So in the commentary of Rashi, who traditionally identified Mount Moriah as the place of the temple, he explained this verse also in the context of the generations living after the destruction. This is a little complicated, but I hope I will be able to explain it. So what you see with I don't remember how to call it in English, the quote signs, it's part of the biblical text, and then comes the interpretation or the commentary of Rashi. Okay? So the Lord will see, he explains, his plain meaning is as the commentary renders it. The Lord selects and sees for himself this place to cause to dwell in his divine presence, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, and to offer here sacrifices. To this day, quote, means future days. For all the coming generations that read this verse say until this day, in reference to the day in which they are living. The Lord will see this binding to forgive Israel every year and to rescue them from trouble, so that it shall be said on this day, in all coming generations, on the mountains of the Lord is seen, the ashes of Isaac heaped up and serving for atonement. So this is Rashi's commentary on Genesis 22 and 2. By the use of the word to this day, to represent the future days of all the generations to come, Rashi transfers the biblical narrative from past to present by using the time frame of every year in the context of the Lord's forgiveness of Israel due to the binding of Isaac. Rashi locates the event in the liturgical frame of Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, the Jewish New Year, the annual day of judgment according to the Jewish calendar. In this two-day liturgical event, the biblical narrative of Isaac's binding is the leitmotif, viewing the obedience of Abraham to God's demand as an ancestral merit, as a model, working in favor of the people of Israel who stand in judgment on that day every year. The biblical text of this narrative is read on the second day of the feast as part of the public ceremony. Allusions to the narrative, as well as citations and phrases derived from the biblical verses and exegetical interpretations on them, were incorporated in many liturgical hymns sung throughout the day. The special prayer ceremonies also include the ritual of blowing the ram's horn to allude to the biblical event that concludes with the sacrifice of a ram instead of Isaac. It seems that the Jews were also aware of the Christian interpretation of the biblical event. The concept of atonement, mentioned by Rashi and already found in the earlier exegetical traditions, might be understood as a polemic answer to the central notion of Christianity's perception of the crucifixion of Christ, typologically embodied in the biblical narrative of Isaac's binding as an act of atonement for the sins of mankind. This notion, followed by Rashi, adopted a concept of atonement opposed to the Christian concept of atonement, turning the one-time Christological penitence into an annual repentance for the sins of Israel. Moreover, Rashi went a step beyond the Jewish traditional interpretation. While according to the Bible and its basic Jewish understanding, Isaac was, in the end, not sacrificed, only binding, Rashi described, and I quote, Isaac's ashes heaped up on the mountain, unquote, as if the sacrifice actually did take place. In later generations, the image of an actual sacrifice became even more prominent and widespread. The biblical narrative serves as a model for 12th century chronicles, penitential poems, and commemorating the righteous people who, during the massacres of the Crusaders in 1096, rather than accepting forced baptism, they themselves killed their children and committed suicide as an act of sanctification of the name of God. These writings, alluding clearly to an actual sacrifice, also influence other liturgical hymns telling the story of Isaac's binding. Inspired by a similar diversity of well-known versions written before and after these pogroms in 1096 at the end of the 11th century, and perhaps also by the most recent persecutions by crusaders in neighboring communities of Brabant, during his own period, the 14th century, the scribe illuminator of the Brussels Pentateuch created a powerful visual variation. He literally merged Rashi's commentary with the image by surrounding the written words for atonement with red burning coals, suggesting a play on the thin border between a real sacrifice and a metaphor. Look, here is the altar, here are the red coals, and this word is atonement. Okay, right on the altar. By introducing the talit, the prayer shawl, which was not part of the visual tradition of the scene, he emphasized the Jewish liturgical understanding of the concept of atonement. The wearing of the talit, the praying shawl, connects Abraham with prayer and transfers the biblical scene to the public liturgical domain, to the synagogue. Furthermore, it fuses the two realms, the biblical and the liturgical. The obedient Abraham, who prays for the sake of his heirs in the future, is also the present-day cantor, who mediates between the congregation and the Lord, begging for mercy for the whole community. This conflation occurred while the devotee was listening to the public reading and at the same time following the text and looking at the image in his book. The image in the Brussels Pentateuch is integrated within the ritual domain of the synagogue, which is restricted to the local Jewish community members, a specific group of a certain religion. In this ritual frame, they are integrated with liturgical attires and gestures, as well as a broad selection of words, scriptures, hymns, commentaries, sermons. Some of these texts are written on the actual manuscripts and spoken or sung in the ritual inner space. Others are additional written and oral tradition known in different degrees to the community members. These are all connected to one another in a dynamic web whose center is the image and text on the page of the sacred liturgical manuscript used by the cantor to conduct the ceremony, and by those members of the community who were able to follow the prayer in their own personal illuminated copies. Visuality played a central role in enlivening the prayers by giving tangible expression to the biblical narrative recited in the public ceremony. The integration of visual components identified with material objects used in the prayer hall, the talit, the prayer shawl, which was not part of the original biblical narrative, went a step further. It blurs the gap between the historical event and the liturgical ceremony, and by so doing, intensified the religious experience of the devotee and his identification with his ancestors, the protagonist of the biblical event that formed a central part in the liturgy. Visuality was also a main channel through which some foreign concepts, products of the mixed urban reality, were entering the Jewish prayer hall, as seen in the next example from Esslingen, which I will present, but I will not discuss in length. In the liturgical hymn, Asher mi ya'asecha kema'asecha, for who can do according to thee works, for the second day of the new year, the annual day of judgment, the scribe of this manuscript copied in large letterings the entire phrase, which you see in front of you. And you shall remember the sacrifice of Isaac as you vowed, and you shall change the measurements of judgment to one of mercy. After copying the section, the scribe left an empty space for an illustration of Isaac's sacrifice that would give even more weight to the meaning of the stressed words. The concept of the willingness of Abraham as ancestral merit has its most salient expression in the liturgical hymn. The hymn describes how, at the very moment when God is about to pass judgment on them, the people of Israel pray to him to remember the merit of their ancestor Abraham, embodied in the 10 trials he underwent, the 10th and most difficult of them being the sacrifice of Isaac. In the center of the upper section of the illustration, the young Isaac is laid on the altar, standing on the mountaintop. Isaac's eyes are covered by one of Abraham's hands as he holds a sword in his other. He turns his head back towards the angel on the right, who, like in the Brussels illumination, holds the blade in one hand and points to the ram caught in the tree, seen below him, right here. To the left of the altar is a candlestick, look here, holding a large candle. To its side, the previous episode is depicted. Abraham takes his son by the arm on his way to the top of the mountain. He turns his head back and points forward, indicating to the son the candlestick and the place of the sacrifice. The candlestick, bearing the large candle placed to the side of the altar, derives from the Christian tradition. Liturgical candles usually accompany depictions of Christian altars of the time, being placed either on them or alongside them. A large candle next to the altar represents the candle of Easter. Every year, the Easter Eve ritual in the church includes taking a light from the new fire and lighting the large candle that symbolizes the light of Christ rising from the dead. The placement of this Easter candle alongside the altar where Isaac is to undergo sacrifice identified it as the altar of the church. I remind you, we are here inside a Hebrew manuscript. Simple, and so the sacrifice here on the altar within a church, symbolizing the sacrifice of Christ and hinting at the Christological significance of Isaac's sacrifice. If so, why would a Christian liturgical item have been chosen to represent the Jewish exegetical component? In Esslingen, Jewish and Christian artisans were working together in the field of manuscript production. Jewish craftsmen were members in the Guild of Parchment Makers, a unique situation which probably occurred in this specific case due to their high reputation in the field. At the same time, Christian artists were hired to illuminate Hebrew manuscripts. The Christian illuminator received precise instruction from the scribe who dictated the details. The artist interpreted the instruction of the Jewish guide in his own Christian terms. The result exemplified the intimate relations between the two religious experiences in the shared urban domain, where the synagogue existed in close proximity to the local churches. Here you have the reference of Sarit Shalev in his article. I did not elaborate on the historical context and the textual sources related to this example in Essingen. You can find it in her article, because I want to leave the last 5 minutes to a modern Israeli visual epilogue. Before I present the modern work, I would like to summarize. We have seen since when there is what we can call Jewish art. We have seen examples for figurative art, although the second commandments, no graven images, etc. And we have seen the innovative solutions, how to deal with it. We recognize the strong links to Jerusalem and its temple, and we got acquainted with the Jewish attitudes to Christian art and artists, a topic I will elaborate upon next week in Rome. All the representations of the sacrifice of Isaac were influenced by their zeitgeist, whether liturgical, political, or both. This is also the case in my next and final example. The sacrifice of Isaac appears to be a central topic for Israeli artists, writers, poets, and thinkers. And while the narrative used to evoke images in the Israeli imagination of self-sacrifice for the sake of national redemption, it has become, mainly since 1967, the Six-Day War, the focus of protest against the seemingly unending demands on the young people. As a result, several striking transformations have taken place in treatments of the story. In addition to the highlighting of Sarah, the mourning mother, the ram has turned into a symbol of these insatiable demands, as in many of Menashe Kadishman's works. Menashe Kadishman, who died 10 years ago, made several works on the subject of the sacrifice of Isaac. Outside the Tel Aviv Museum, the semi-abstract and flat sculpture has 3 components: Isaac, the ram, and 2 mourning women, or maybe parents. The dead Isaac is represented by a round, peaceful, closed-eyed face lying on the ground, facing the sky. The menacing ram, towering above Isaac, is represented by a horned, beastly face that connotes the devilish representations from Western tradition. The 2 mourning women are standing side by side. Their bodies are united into a single robed figure with 2 mourning faces. The hand of God, or the angel, are missing. Also Abraham, he is not there. Kadishman has done a certain violence to the narrative, excluding God, Abraham, and the angel, and inserting 2 non-textual grieving figures. The notion that the sacrifice of Isaac is somehow the prototypical anti-war narrative reconfigured into the debate over the morality of fathers sending their sons to war seems far-fetched at best. But as always, it is complicated. Kadishman worked as a shepherd on a kibbutz in his youth, and in fact has used sheep and rams as a recurring motif in his work throughout his career. Additionally, in 1973, he and his son modeled for Joel Seeger's Isaac's Sacrifice. That would explain how he has been deeply obsessed with the Isaac story since the early 1980s, producing many drawings, paintings, and sculptures. According to Kadishman, and I quote, "Neither do I consider the story of the sacrifice of Isaac as signifying a divine command or decree of God. For me, it symbolizes the fear of the individual to defy the dictates of society and its conventions," unquote. Not surprisingly, He understands that a man who sacrifices his son sacrifices himself and his entire future. This sculpture was executed in the shadow of the war in Lebanon and his own son's induction into the army. As I mentioned earlier, when I quoted Rashi, there was a Jewish tradition according to which Isaac was sacrificed. The notion of Isaac's ashes already appeared in various compilations of midrashim dated from the 5th century onward. However, while the literary image of the ashes is usually presented as a clear metaphor, as if they are heaped up upon the altar, we saw that Rashi's version appeared without the words as if, and the same did one of his teachers, the 11th century Meir Bar Yitzchak, the famous emissary of worms. And I quote, "Please, the respectful and blessed holy name will be seen at the top of the house of your glory. Isaac, his only son, his ashes are piled up and bound." Dropping the as if words may significantly change the meaning. Without them, the ashes of Isaac are no longer a mere literary image or metaphor. The results seem to diverge greatly from the direct meaning of the biblical text and move closer to the Christian concept of a real sacrifice of a son. To make the death of Isaac the end of the story, as does Kadishman, obliterates the rest of the Jewish history. It twists the narrative to become a mere tool for personal guilt and anger. Similarly, depicting the ram as a triumphant and violent immoral power while simultaneously removing God as the prime mover in this narrative avoids the really difficult issue the sacrifice of Isaac continues to pose about God's role and responsibility. It's not here, this difficult issue. Kadishman's sacrifice of Isaac is a powerful and brutal indictment of war, the forces of violence, and the tragic death of innocents. Since October 7th, 2023, protests exist next to this sculpture as a ritual. The synagogue praying hall is replaced by the hostages square praying hall at the entrance to the museum, which became the shrine next to the sculpture. The families and the people who care gather here for by now 584 days protesting, praying for the war to be over and for the hostages to return home. It seems that the contract between God and Abraham, consequently with his sons Isaac and Ishmael, is on hold. Human sacrifice on both sides, here and in Gaza, is continually and daily paid. And for that, if you ask me, there is no atonement. Thank you.
Thank you.